Welcome back for another deep dive. This time we're taking a look at something pretty cool in Excel.
Oh, yeah.
The offset function. It's part of DAX, which stands for Data Analysis Expressions. And it's really helpful when you need to manipulate data.
Right.
Like, have you ever wanted to grab data from certain rows based on where they are compared to other rows?
Yeah, I can see that being really helpful.
Like if you're looking at your sales numbers.
Uh-huh.
And you want to compare this month to the same month last year.
Oh, yeah, that's a good example.
Offset would be perfect for that.
Definitely. It can really pinpoint exactly what you need, like a magic tool.
Okay, so it sounds like magic. But before we get too deep into that, can we start with the basics? Like, what does offset actually do?
Well, imagine you have a big list of data, kind of like a line at a concert. You can point at someone and say, 3 people ahead or 2 people behind.
Right.
Offset is similar. You pick out data from a row based on where it is compared to another row.
Okay, so like with my sales data, I could tell it to grab the number from 12 rows back, which would be the same month last year.
You got it. And that's just one thing it can do. The best part of offset is how flexible it is.
Okay, but how do you tell it to do all that? It can't be as easy as go back 12 rows.
You're right. It's not quite that simple. That's where syntax and parameters come in.
Okay.
Those are like instructions you give offset to tell it things like how many rows to move, which table to look at, stuff like that.
All right, so let's hear these instructions then. What do we need to tell it first?
First, we tell it how many rows to move forward or backward. That's called the delta parameter.
Delta, like the Greek letter.
Pretty much. A positive delta means moving down the rows, and a negative one means moving up.
Makes sense.
So if you want to see data 5 rows below, you'd use a delta of 5. To go 3 rows up, use -3.
Okay, so delta tells it how many rows to jump. But how does it know which table to even look at?
Yeah.
I mean, I might have a bunch of tables in my spreadsheet.
That's right. You got to tell it that too. That's the relation parameter.
Okay.
It basically tells offset, hey, this is the table you're using. You can give it the name of the table or even use a formula to pick the table based on certain conditions.
So I'd say, okay, my relation is this table called sales data, and then use delta to tell it how many rows to move within that table.
Exactly. You're getting it. Now, those are the 2 most basic parameters, but there are a few more that give you even more control over how offset works.
Okay, hit me with them. What else can we do?
Sometimes you might not want to use offset on your entire table.
Okay.
You might want to break it down into smaller parts and then use offset on each part separately.
Why would I want to do that?
Like, say you have sales data for different regions.
Right.
Using the parameter called partition by, you can divide your data into groups based on region and apply offset to each region on its own.
Okay, so like mini tables.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
So I can compare trends without data from other regions messing things up.
You got it. Now, within each mini table or partition, we got to tell offset where to start its calculations.
Okay.
Right, because if we're using delta to move rows, it needs a starting point, like a current row.
Right, to use as like a reference point.
Exactly. And that's what the match by parameter's for.
Okay.
It lets you set the rules for finding that current row within each partition.
So if I wanted to compare sales to last year, but for each region separately,
right,
I'd use partition by to make separate groups for each region. Then at each region's a little section, I'd use match by to find the row with this month's data and use delta to go back 12 rows for last year's data.
Exactly. It's like you're giving offset step-by-step instructions for each region. Find this month, then jump back 12 rows.
This is making a lot more sense now. But you mentioned there are even more parameters, right?
Yeah, there are.
Should we keep going or are we saving those?
Let's save them for part 2. We'll cover the rest of those, and more importantly, we'll dive into some of the potential problems and limits with offset so you can avoid those.
Sounds good. I'm ready to learn more. All right, so far we've covered the basics of offset. Delta tells it how many rows to move, and relation tells it which table we're looking at. Then there's partition by, which lets us break the data down, and match by, which helps us set a starting point for offset in each of those little sections.
Right, it's a lot to keep track of.
It is. But you mentioned there are also some potential problems and limits with offset, right? I'd love to hear about those so I can, avoid any surprises.
Yeah, for sure. So one thing to remember is that offset uses the surrounding data, the context, to figure out the current row if you don't tell it specifically with match by.
Okay, context. That sounds a little vague.
Think of it like this. You're reading a book and you come across the word he.
Okay.
You automatically know who he refers to because of the sentences before it, right?
Right. It's all about the surrounding words giving you clues.
Exactly. It's the same with offset. It looks at the data around it, specifically what are called outer values, to figure out which row to start from.
Okay, so what happens if there are a few different outer values that could work?
That's a great question. And yeah, that can cause some problems. If offset sees multiple possible starting points, it might give you back several rows of data instead of just one. Or worse, if there are no matching outer values, you might get an empty table or an error message.
So it's like if that word he could refer to two different people, you wouldn't know who they were talking about.
Exactly. That's why it's super important to organize your data so that it's clear to offset which row to start from. And match by is usually the best way to avoid that kind of confusion.
Got it. Any other traps to watch out for?
Here's one that gets people all the time. You're trying to use offset in a calculated column, and that column is on the same table as the data you're using. You absolutely need to use the order by parameter in this case.
But isn't order by just for sorting the data in those little partitions we talked about?
It is, but in this situation, it's even more important. Without order by, Excel can't figure out the order of the rows when you're trying to calculate a column based on itself, you know.
Oh, I see. It's like trying to describe a word by using that same word in the definition.
Yes, exactly. You need that clear order set by order by so that offset can do its job properly.
Okay, so we've got context, outer values, and the importance of order by in those calculated columns. What else should we be aware of when it comes to offset's limitations?
Well, the main thing is that offset is designed to work within a single table.
Okay.
So if you need to grab data from multiple tables, you'll have to use other DAX functions along with offset or find a different way to do it.
It's like a specialized tool. Great for a specific job, but not for everything, right?
Perfect analogy. The trick is knowing when offset is the right tool for the task and when you need something else.
All right, so we've covered a lot of potential problems here. Are there any tricks or workarounds we can use to avoid all this and make sure we're getting the right results?
Of course. Remember that partition by parameter we talked about?
Yeah.
Well, it can really be a lifesaver in situations like these.
How so?
By dividing your data into smaller, more focused partitions based on whatever makes sense, you can often avoid the confusion and make sure offset is working with clearly defined pieces of information.
So it's like creating smaller, more manageable chunks that offset can handle more easily.
Exactly. It's a great way to simplify things and minimize the chance of errors. And there are other DAX functions that play well with offset.
Oh yeah, like what?
For example, you can use offset with calculate
Okay.
to apply filters to your data before you even use offset to grab specific rows. It's like saying, first, find all the sales from the West Coast and then use offset to grab the numbers from last year.
That's powerful stuff, like fine-tuning your data before you even use offset.
Right. Another good combo is rankx with offset. Rankx lets you rank things within those partitions, and then you can use offset to target the ranked items.
So if I wanted to see the top 3 products in each region, I could use rankx to rank them, and then offset to grab their sales data.
Exactly. When you start combining offset with other DAX functions, the possibilities are huge.
So it sounds like offset is a game changer for anyone who works with data a lot. It's like having this secret weapon for analyzing data.
It is, but like any powerful tool, it takes practice and, a willingness to try things out. Don't be afraid to mess up along the way. That's how you really learn.
Great advice. Okay, before we move on, there's one more thing in the remarks section that I found interesting. It says that if all the columns in your table are made with DAX table functions, offset will throw an error. What's that about?
Well, it's because DAX table functions create what we call virtual tables.
Okay.
And these virtual tables don't have a fixed row order like regular tables do. So offset gets confused and can't figure out where the rows are.
So it's like trying to find a book on a bookshelf that keeps rearranging itself, right?
Exactly. Too much chaos for offset to work with.
I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've gone deep into how offset works, its strengths, its weaknesses, and even some tips and tricks.
Yeah, we have. So are you ready to see how all of this applies to real-life situations?
Absolutely. Let's get practical.
Because in the last part of our deep dive, we'll explore some real-world uses and see how offset can solve real data problems.
Can't wait. Bring on the examples. All right, so we've talked about all the nuts and bolts of offset, how it works, what it's good at, and what to watch out for. But now I really want to see how we can use it in the real world.
Yeah, let's get practical.
You mentioned some real-world examples, so let's dive into those. Where does offset really shine?
Remember that example of comparing this month's sales to the same month last year?
Yeah.
That's where offset is super useful. Let's say you have a table with sales data for every month and you want to make a new column that shows the year-over-year growth. Offset can do that.
Okay, I'm picturing my sales data table. How would I actually use offset to calculate that growth rate?
You'd use offset to grab the sales number from 12 rows back, which would be the sales for that same month but in the previous year.
Right.
Then you just use a simple formula to figure out the percentage change between those two numbers.
So offset does the hard part of finding the right numbers, and then a regular formula does the calculation. I like it.
Right. And that's just one example. Offset is really flexible. Think about something like inventory management. You could use offset to see how fast items are moving out of your warehouse.
How would that work?
Imagine a table that tracks the stock levels of different products each week.
Yep.
You could use offset to compare this week's stock level to last week's level. That way you can see how quickly each product is selling, and you can maybe even spot potential stockouts before they happen.
So I can avoid those last-minute orders when I realize I'm almost out of something I'm sold.
Exactly. It's about having the information you need to make good decisions.
Okay, sales analysis and inventory management. What else? Are there any other situations where offset is a lifesaver?
Oh, there are tons. Financial modeling, for instance. You could use offset to project future cash flows based on past trends, or calculate rolling averages for key financial metrics to get a better picture of how your company is performing.
So offset isn't just for spreadsheet nerds then?
Definitely not. Anyone who works with data can benefit from offset, especially if you need to analyze trends, make comparisons, or just get a deeper understanding of your data.
It sounds powerful, but I guess like any advanced function, mastering offset takes practice and experimentation, right?
That's right. It's not about memorizing all the rules or every single parameter combination.
Okay.
It's about understanding the logic behind offset and knowing how to adapt it to different situations.
Like learning a new language. You don't become fluent just by reading the grammar book.
Exactly. You have to actually use the language, make mistakes, and gradually build your confidence.
So the more you practice with offset, the better you'll get at it. That makes sense.
And if you ever get stuck, there are tons of resources out there. Microsoft's website, blog posts, videos.
There's a whole community of Excel people ready to help.
That's great to know. So, to wrap up our deep dive into offset, I want to leave everyone with a challenge. Think about how you could use offset in your own work. What kind of data do you have that could benefit from this kind of analysis?
Good idea.
Maybe you're tracking website visits, marketing campaigns, or project timelines. Be creative and see what you can discover.
That's a great challenge. Remember, there's no one right way to use offset. That's the beauty of it. You can adapt it to so many different things.
Well said. So that's it for our deep dive into offset. We hope you learned something new and are ready to tackle your data challenges with a little more confidence.
Definitely.
Thanks for joining us, and until next time, happy analyzing.